This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Monterey Bay Public Radio. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of my broadcast is World Watchers. And before I begin the program, I want to say that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAZU's staff or board of directors. This Our World Watchers is made possible in part by Aries Arts in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for over 20 years. Also, I do want to apologize last week for losing my voice, but it's back again now, and I hope it stays together for another long period of years. That hasn't happened in a long, long time. The broadcast of World Watchers is now numbered, as of this evening, 837. It's December 21st, 1987, and of course, with Christmas coming in a few days and Hanukkah continuing, and the New Year's following the next week, I want to combine all three and wish you all a happy holiday. I wish I could write to all the people that write to me and send them holiday cards and reach out and touch you and hug you and thank you, because you're very special people, you World Watchers. I appreciate your continuing listening, your support, the material you send to me, your contribution in terms of the talk show, the reading material you do, and your continued interest in these affairs. I'm very sentimental about December 21st. That's my favorite day of the year, practically, because that's the shortest day of the year, and as of tomorrow, the days start getting longer, and I love it as we edge towards spring, and I love the summer, the spring and summer, particularly the warm months. And December 21st, even though we're just beginning the season of winter, it's actually going to be lighter pretty soon, and I look forward to that. It seems to be a very special time. I love that day because it means it's a turning point, and we're on our way to spring. I'm not going to touch subjects such as Gary Hart in the race, or Edwin Meese, or the Iran-Contra, many of the things that are in the news this evening that are important, because I put them on the back burner and feel that there are some other matters that are very pressing that I want to share with you this evening as we conclude this year, as we're winding down, just one more broadcast before the end of the year, and share these thoughts with you. There was a picture, quite a large picture, in the parade section of the Sunday papers that is printed all around the country, with a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding his rifle, the one with the Socialist Workers newspaper in his right hand, the rifle in the left hand, the pistol coming out of his pocket, and it's a portrait, it's a artist, it's his picture, but then the artist has done eagles around the corner, and it's an advertisement for a book that just came out called Made in USA, an Americanization in Modern Art, printed by the California Press, University of California Press, $24.95, and underneath it says, affirming, in quotes, the Americanness of the armed assassin. This Ed Bash painting is one of hundreds representing American life and aesthetics through the images of a person named Joan Crawford. The idea is that this armed assassin is America, and repeating for each generation the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, that he is the American assassin. And to change that point of view of history at this point is almost impossible, because we researchers have to buck against the mass media, the artists portraying Oswald and continuing the big lie that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin, the lone assassin of the President of the United States. Along those lines, in this morning's paper, reprint from the LA Times, the Monterey Herald, December 21st, large article, Dallas to open the sixth-floor museum where Oswald shot John Kennedy. And this, I mentioned this last year, that they're going to make a museum with an elevator, outdoor elevator, taking you up to the sixth floor. And the article said Lee Harvey Oswald waited here for the motorcade to pass, and then he pulled the rifle trigger that killed President Kennedy. And then in the article continues to say, by the end of 1988, the sixth floor of the building will be open after 25 years. And you can see where Lee Harvey Oswald stood and planned his act, the Assassin's Act. And you take the elevator up there. The remaining 1.5 million is being raised and donated so that there'll be a closed-off area. where you can see where Lee Harvey Oswald kept his rifle and his clipboard. Of course, this museum isn't going to tell you there were no fingerprints of Lee Harvey Oswald on the rifle at any single time, and that Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle came in the mail from Chicago, mail order, to a post office box that he said his wife could pick up. And this famous picture in the artwork of Lee Harvey Oswald doesn't go on to say that the shadow underneath his nose doesn't match the shadow of the rifle, and Oswald said it was his head, and this picture was superimposed at the chin, and it isn't even a whole picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. It's not even his body. And the picture was taken at Neely Street, which is a long, fascinating story of an apartment where they lived at one time, and then when they moved out of there, it was not used by any other person. They went to New Orleans, and it was kept vacant, and the Dallas police force used it to take pictures and had access to the property up to the time that John Kennedy was murdered. It wasn't rented to anybody else, and therefore pictures could be taken of somebody holding the rifle in that apartment at Neely Street. It was not an apartment that was used for rental purposes, but was a safe house. So pretty soon, every person that goes through Dallas with any curiosity will go through this place and be told, here is where he stood, here is where he shot, and it is very difficult to change the course of history when people are given this story. Now, a subscriber to World Watchers, a long listener, sent me some material that is pertinent to the real story of who killed John Kennedy, and it came from a book called The End of the War. It was written by Charles Whiting in 1973. And in this book, Mr. Whiting isn't talking about John Kennedy except in one sentence, but he's talking about Martin Bormann, who disappeared after the war, Admiral Donitz, who was to take over for Hitler when Hitler was no longer in power, was meeting with persons like Albert Speer and Martin Bormann. And in this book, on page 97, Mr. Whiting says that Martin Bormann was a subject for investigation after the war. He became a post-war mystery number one. He disappeared. Since then, he has been sought all over the world, variously disguised as a monk, a coffee farmer, and the man behind the Kennedy murders. And this was written in 1973. Now, going back, World Watchers, to 1979, 6 years later, I was able to get a book called Treason for My Daily Bread by Mikhail Lebedev. It was printed in Great Britain, and on World Watchers 379, that goes back a long, long time for us, 8 years actually, I did a broadcast on the involvement of Martin Bormann and the John Kennedy assassination, and Mr. Lebedev was very familiar with the operations, and in that broadcast, in 1979, I said there was a high-level Nazi involvement in killing John Kennedy. Martin Bormann, Hitler's top director, escaped to Paraguay after World War II. These were the items that Lebedev was talking about, that Bormann had the assistance of the Italian Church and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he was very close to Adolf Hitler. I cited the book, The Mufti and the Fuhrer. That Lebedev and Bormann were isolated in an Italian monastery right after the war, until 1945. The war was over. Bormann disappeared May the 1st, 1945. Arrangements were set to send them out of Italy with the Jewish Haganah group disguised as Jews. And setting that up earlier, of course, was Otto von Bolschwing, who comes to California and is active with the defense and the CIA and the Galen operation. And this book said that Martin Bormann sent Lebedev to New Orleans to find anti-communists and part of the Nazi Bormann Brotherhood, and that was the Clay Shaw group in New Orleans, and worked with David Ferry, Clay Shaw, Guy Bannister, and Ruth. Ruth Payne was the woman who housed the Oswalds and transported them to New Orleans, and back. And this book is a very important book. If any of you don't have that broadcast, you may want to get that hour that I did, number 379, on the role of Martin Bormann's and the assassination. Now, Mr. Whiting mentioned him in 1973. This book came out in 1977. And on that broadcast, I made a lot of comparisons to what is actually known about the Kennedy assassination, the Nazi connections, Oswald's mentor, George de Mohrenschildt, and his close cousin, Baron Rangel, of the International Bormann Brotherhood. And these are the connections that are concealed from us as a large mass of people. The material's there if you wanted. A writer who's an authority on World War II and Nazism, Whiting, brings up in 1973 the Bormann connections to the murder of John Kennedy, and it was the Treason for My Daily Bread that came out later that in 1977 that goes into great detail on the Bormann connections. And of course, when I wrote my article for Rebel magazine on the Nazi connections to the murder of John Kennedy, it was probably the first clear-cut article on the high Nazi connections to the murder of John Kennedy that anybody has ever written, with the exception of this book, Treason for My Daily Bread. And of course, I covered a broader, different kind of area of material that included a lot of other persons in our government and so forth besides just Martin Bormann and the Nazis. Now, I bring that up now because the rewriting of history or the concealing of history is so important, and we are all being cheated out of the right to know things that have happened because there are cliques of people, even cliques of researchers, that do not want you to know about these connections. Now, whether they are part of that team, just to say they are CIA doesn't explain enough. I can cite a group of them, 10 or 20 of them, who keep from you and block from you the real connections to how our country was overthrown, actually taken over after 1943, and the role that Martin Bormann and Rudolf Hess and Heinrich Himmler had in the Nazification of America. Now, this past few weeks there have been articles about the United Nations releasing their files in the archives and about some of the files that were missing. And this past week, December the 12th, there was an article in San Jose Mercury, UN finds the missing files in their archives. They said that most, not all, most of the 433 files on Nazi war criminals reported missing this week have been found at the UN offices on Park Avenue. Some have been misplaced. Some were gone, just discovered to be gone in 1986, and goodness knows where they went or if they were rewritten or destroyed. Official sources told the Associated Press that 350 of those files were located in one place. So there were 433 that were gone, and 350 were in one special place, and they don't tell you where the other ones were. We still don't know where the 73 other were. But the articles that I have that are important to me about the missing records are important because only two names are mentioned in these articles specifically, one being Kurt Waldheim and his memos and documents about his work with Yugoslavians is gone from this record. But also, the San Jose Mercury said, one source said, the file on Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo chief who committed suicide in 1945, was among those missing. He said it had been sent to Nuremberg, West Germany. Sources say the missing files could include dismissed or adjourned cases with insufficient evidence of prosecution. Now, if Heinrich Himmler died in 1945, and I'm beginning seriously to doubt that he died, I know that Martin Bormann is alive and that Rudolf Hess probably was a substitute, the one at Spandau, and that's why there's so much mystery about Spandau always. But if Heinrich Himmler committed suicide in 1945, why would a dead German's files be sent to the United Nations? These were living war criminals. These weren't the dead ones that were sent here. All the dead Nazi files weren't here. These were the active list of war criminals. And the Washington Times had a story, December 15th. United Nations, again, says the war crime files are all accounted for. And they said the Himmler files were sent to Nuremberg, where the Allied powers carried out war crime investigations after World War II. And Himmler, as the head of the Gestapo, was not among those tried in Nuremberg. He allegedly committed suicide after the Allied troops captured him. But and then it says the United Nations had these files since 1948, and the purpose of sending them here was to still investigate some of the war crimes. Now, actually, the investigation of the war criminals was over by 1948, and Himmler's papers were in this country, which makes me believe, because they were listed as being in this country, that Himmler was in fact alive, and there's not that much evidence that Himmler died. In fact, there's hardly any. Among those people whose names are on this list of the wanted Nazi criminals, the most dangerous from the archives of the United Nations, is Heinrich Himmler. Now, Himmler was declared dead for many, many years after the war. And then the powers that be opened up the grave because he was recognized walking around very easily in South America. So they went to the grave of where Mr. Himmler was buried, and there were 3 skulls in there. I've mentioned it on the program many, many times through the years. It was a joke. If you have to open up this grave, here are 3 skulls, now guess whose, and it was not Himmler. So knowing that they lied about that grave, and they lied several times about Martin Bormann's death, I wonder now about Himmler. And the reason Himmler is important, and I wasn't going to get back to the occult and the seriousness of the occult and the Church of Satan and our Joint Chiefs of Staff and our NATO forces with services conducted by Michael Aquino and goodness knows how many others in Germany at the castle of Heinrich Himmler in Westphalia. The thing that would make sense would be that if Himmler were alive and stirring these people on, and he's far from dead, the cult of Heinrich Himmler is very strong, and he could still be around, as is John J. McCloy and Hermann Apps of the Deutsche Bank, and we have John Paul II, who was in Krakow when the Jews, 30, 40, 50,000 were eliminated from that city, and he worked at Auschwitz for I.G. Farben when the extermination was going on, and he is the Pope that is very instrumental in a lot of the Cold War activities now. And Richard von Weizsäcker is the president of Germany, and his father was president. He was the liaison between Adolf Hitler and the Vatican, and now the new head of NATO is a German from the German Defense Ministry, and Himmler's services at Westphalia could be a continuation of what Himmler is doing, not what was done in the past. And when you get people like Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino with very top security clearance, still working for the military, worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency with Daniel Graham there, co-partner with Fritz Kramer. Faceless people, here's Michael Aquino, can't be kicked out of the Army. He's untouchable, identified in terms of turning children into the Church of Satan and using them at his own residence, and going to the Himmler Castle. It's very important to see how high up the Himmler influence goes when they teach the Church of Set and the love of Satan in the Vietnam area, Vietnam War, in terms of psychological brainwashing. And now again, the name Himmler comes up because of his papers were here in the United States, and somebody probably knew that Himmler wasn't dead. It was among the living Nazis, and then it was sent back to Germany to keep with allegedly the suicidal Nazis. Now, the same friend who sent me the material about Martin Bormann in 1973, being possibly linked, suggested some role in the murder of the Kennedys. This same book by Charles Whiting, published in 1973, called The End of the War, has some information that gives insight into what happened to Heinrich Himmler, and also the truth of why we don't know more about the occult, or why for years it was kept from us, from our actually learning about it. There wasn't that much out. And in this book, it says that when the Americans got custody of Heinrich Himmler, he was not dead. Now, he was head of the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, the idea behind the Liebersborn, the Children for Hitler. He was probably the most powerful man, head of all the police force and army in all of Nazi Germany and all the countries they occupied, ran the concentration camps, was one of the heads or geniuses behind Interpol, the international police. And it seems that when the Allies got Himmler, there would have been photographs right away or pictures of him to prove that they had him, and then the people who guarded him, as they did Rudolf Hess, would make sure that they guarded him from that moment. They could go through his mouth, put him in a dental chair, and make sure there was no cyanide, instead of having an empty pocket where if he wanted to take, he could. And the story about Himmler's death is that a Sergeant Major Austin began to examine Himmler to see if he had anything that would lead to suicide, and told him to take off his underpants and shirt and get undressed. And Himmler said, he doesn't know who I am. And Austin said, yes, I do, get undressed. And, of course, the Nazis took the cyanide in their teeth, so it's silly to look in his behind for the cyanide. But according to the story, a Colonel Murphy of intelligence and a Dr. Wells were called in because Himmler bit the bullet, so to speak. A small black knob was sticking out of his mouth. There was a gap in his teeth. And according to the story, he died of poison while in the hands and in the captivity of the American forces, who could have gone through his mouth from the moment they had him if they wanted them. And according to this book, he died from the poison, and they just simply threw a blanket over him and left him for 2 days. Now, I don't believe that our American forces kept Heinrich Himmler for 2 days on a cot, and then the responsibility for his body was left to Sergeant Major Austin, who buried him in a spot, so we have to believe that he dug the grave himself, that he wrapped Himmler in an army blanket, that he wound him in camouflage netting, that he secured him with telephone wire, and that this non-commissioned officer is the only man in the entire world who knows where Himmler's remains are. And in this book, he's Sergeant Major Austin. There's no first initial, so you couldn't find Austin in the 50 states of the United States. And Sergeant Major Austin is with no first letter. Where is he today? And, of course, Dr. Wells has no first name. And Colonel Murphy, the intelligence officer, has no first name. And we are to believe that a non-commissioned person was in charge of disposing of the most important man of World War, one of the most important persons of World War II, certainly. And he had well-laid plans for World War III set aside. And Himmler was a very well-known through the police force, the army, the Gestapo. This isn't the kind of person that one officer digs a grave and puts him there. And I think a good goal to save America and to save ourselves, it sounds a little ridiculous, I know, is to look for and ask our congressman where this Mr. Austin is, Sergeant Major Austin, and demand that that grave be dug up. Because if our Joint Chief of Staff, our NATO forces, our armed services, and our Delta Force, Michael Aquino is part of the Delta Force with Oliver North, that elite crack group that are like the Freikorps in Germany, the special forces that literally can take over the army someday, the elite, which will be the future Gestapo. I think it is mandatory because of the rituals in Himmler's castle and our Joint Chiefs, and the thing that they're doing to the young people in America, teaching them the goose step, the arm up in the air, trying to make an army of these people through the occult. It's essential to know if he's not buried there, then who is going to these services and how high up it goes to Fritz Kramer on the National Security Council, the late Otto von Bolschwing's connections, the Waffen-SS, and his connections to Ronald Reagan and Helene von Damme, and the head of the Iron Guard, Romanian Iron Guard, Nikolai Malaxa, was taken to Richard Nixon's office in Whittier, California, and then down to Argentina. And our whole young generation is being wiped out. And I think that the symptoms and signs of it have been around for a while, but we haven't been able to finger what is happening to these people. Now, according to this book, at the end of the war, Winston Churchill was very angry, according to this Mr. Whiting. In London, Winston Churchill was soon to write in protest to Montgomery, the British officer, "I do not like to see German admirals and generals with whom we have recently made arrangements being made to stand with their hands above their heads." Winston Churchill didn't like the treatment of the Germans after the war. Now, the Germans had nicely bombed London, and children were separated from their parents, but Alan Dulles of the OSS and William Stevenson of British intelligence and William Donovan of OSS were making arrangements from 1943 in Bern, Switzerland, for the nice transfer of the Nazis and Himmler's top eight, as says Karl Wolff, the liaison of Himmler to our OSS and American intelligence, was making arrangements for 2 years after the war. And according to Mr. Whiting, Churchill objected to the treatment of the Nazis after the war, as if standing with their hands above their heads is such a terrible crime after shooting people, burying them alive, cutting them up in front of their children, cooking them in ovens and gas chambers, stomping on them, burning towns down, peeling skin off alive. Winston Churchill didn't like that. He said, "I don't like to see the admirals and generals with whom we recently made arrangements." And what were the arrangements that Winston Churchill made? That, for goodness sakes, the Germans couldn't put their hands above their heads, that offended Winston Churchill. A lot of people think of Winston Churchill as a great freedom fighter, but what they don't realize, and I mentioned it before on the air a few weeks ago, that Churchill only went after Germany and had to get in on the struggle to end the war quickly when Germany was turning back and being beaten by the Russians, who held their own, because then Great Britain would have to live with Russia if Germany were defeated, and America and Great Britain came in when it seemed now that Russia could move all the way to the Atlantic coast, and on the guise of stopping the Germans, we were stopping the Russians and incorporating with the Germans for the future. So this unfortunate instance of them with their hands in the air, he added that he didn't intend to humiliate the Germans, but the opinion, according to this book, is that they had these pictures of the Germans being questioned or hands in the air to show the Russians that they had that they intended to be rigid with them, so the Russians wouldn't catch on to the deals that were being made. And I think it's important to follow the thinking of Winston Churchill and where he was when he not only protected the admirals and generals, but the exhumation of, I think, Himmler is mandatory, considering the deals that were being made for 2 years prior to the end of the war. Now, a listener to World Watchers wrote to me about a book, which I do have. I've had it for many years. In fact, when it first came out, since 1973, called The Spear of Destiny. It's, the subtitle is The Occult Power Behind the Spear Which Pierced the Side of Christ. It's written by Trevor Ravenscroft. And I must admit that in all the years that I've been doing the research on the murder of John Kennedy or the interconnecting links of the Nazis to that event or to the taking of America, there was something in me, as there is in most people, that puts the occult aside as something that belongs to something very weird, not an everyday part of our thinking. The weirdness and madness in Germany broke out after 1933, where Satan really took over the entire German country and the countries they conquered. But what happened then, we were not allowed to know. So I got out the book, which I've had readily available, to study again in terms of the connections of our youth, the children in nursery schools, the human sacrifices, and the Delta Force, Thomas Aquino, and the glazed look of Oliver North. And I began to read The Spear of Destiny again. And in the very introduction of it, and I'll continue reading it every week, it begins this way, and I think the introduction here explains a lot of what is happening today. It begins by saying the man who would have written this book, but for his untimely death, was Dr. Walter Johannes Stein, a Vienna-born scientist, doctor of philosophy, who during World War II was a confidential advisor to Winston Churchill. Now, the late Dr. Stein met an untimely death. The introduction goes on to say that he was told and warned not to tell about the occult. He was the expert on the spear that was in Vienna. He was an expert on how it influenced Hitler and Himmler, and Hitler wanted him to serve him and continue as his advisor. He left Germany and went to England to advise Winston Churchill on the occult, on what Hitler wanted or knew or was doing. But it seems that Winston Churchill was either very much a part of it or believed in it and wanted to maintain it as a secret, so that this is one of the reasons the Allied forces between the Americans and the British didn't go into it. This book, The Spear of Destiny, said that Stein had a lot of pressure brought upon him to bear to dissuade him from revealing what is now presented as the content of this book, that his work finally came out in 1973. The final issue was he would have been very proud of this introduction, says, and he was very influential in teaching the Allies about the minds of the Nazi Party and what they were thinking. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then I'll go back to The Spear of Destiny, a very important book. World Watchers number 837. In the introduction of The Spear of Destiny, it says that Winston Churchill himself, the same Winston Churchill that didn't like us having the Nazi generals and admirals with their hands in the air, Winston Churchill himself was insistent that the occultism of the Nazi Party should not under any circumstances be revealed to the general public. In my library, I only have 3 books on the occult and the direct links to Himmler and Hitler. Winston Churchill was insistent. The failure of the Nuremberg trial to identify the nature of the evil at work behind the outer facade of National Socialism convinced him that it would take another 3 decades, 30 years or more, to pass before a large enough readership could be present to comprehend the initiation rites and the black magic practices of the inner core of the Nazi leadership. It would take 3 generations. Winston Churchill sadly witnessed the extent to which the Allied prosecutors, or rather the author of this book, who put together, witnessed the extent to which the Allied prosecutors at these trials for crimes against humanity lacked the moral imagination to perceive the apocalyptic countenance of civilization that had arisen in Germany between the 2 world wars, a civilization based upon magical Welschen, I can't pronounce the German, Weltanschauung, I hope that's right, which substituted the swastika for the cross, and the Church of Satan is to take away religion and worship the devil, that the devil is the one you worship. Now, the Allied prosecutors, which included Leon Jaworski, were people who, identical to the Warren Commission, the Watergate investigation, the Koreagate, and certainly you see with the Iran-Contra, have confused and obscured. They've obscured the FEMA, the National Emergency Plans, the role of Ollie North with these people in holding the atomic bomb. Well, he has been mentally investigated and found to have lacked certain parts of his reasoning or emotions, that he's responsible at one time for carrying around the signals for starting World War III. The Iran-Contra has been negligent across the board on about 40 issues that scream to be opened up, in the same way with the Nuremberg trial. The author of this book, the man who put it together, said he understood why a unanimous agreement had been made among the judges, and I never was aware of this. I read this a long time ago, but it didn't sink in. There was a unanimous agreement among the judges at Nuremberg to treat the accused Germans as though they were an integral part of the accepted humanist system of the Western world, to have admitted, even for an instant, what their defeated enemies were really like, to have lifted the veil, and think of Woodward and Casey's veil. Casey was part of that with the OSS, to have lifted the veil to reveal the real motives for such an astonishing reversal of values might have opened millions of people to the risk of a terrible corruption. See, their value was, we will not tell you. It is really another religion, just as the Moonies evolved in 1954. This was a long, long religion that worshipped Satan, worshipped evil, went into human sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and the judges and the court decided that the people around the world were not intellectually or emotionally able to handle what was the real motive behind that war, which has continued with the Korean War, Laotian War, Cambodia, Vietnam, in Chile, Brazil, the death squads, in Guatemala, El Salvador, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, all over the world, South Africa, Zaire, Uganda, Ethiopia, you name it. Each country is individually being decimated with people connected directly to these links that were set up after World War II under Otto Skorzeny and Reinhard Gehlen, that continued their forces, but those people opposing these forces or opposing dictatorships never had a half a shake to understand how deep these rituals were in the very highest offices and officers of the land, and included the justices, the chief justices, and the courts to not tell you what the motive is as the motive grew like a disease. It's like having cancer and a large amount of cancer, and the doctors are in agreement that they're not going to tell you about it for 30 years. The Spear of Destiny said it was apparent to Dr. Stein that a decision had been made on the highest political level to explain the most atrocious crimes in the history of mankind as simply being a result of mental aberration and the systematic perversion of natural instincts. It was thought expedient in dry, psychoanalytical terms when considering the motives for incarcerating millions of human beings in gas ovens, rather than for them to reveal that these practices were an integral part of a dedicated service to evil power. And not only was it dedicated to that, but there was a vow for 1,000 years, and the vow was connected and continued by the silence of the judges and the courts into what was really going on behind the formation of Nazism. Then this Spear of Destiny gets even more important to put together explanations that make sense today. I had it, as I say, in 1973, but I didn't comprehend it then. This book goes on. The publication of Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception heralded the kind of change in public opinion which Dr. Stein, a scientist and philosopher from Vienna, had anticipated. It attacked the prevailing skepticism regarding the validity of occultism. It attacked that skepticism and went into the higher levels of consciousness. And Aldous Huxley died in Santa Barbara the day John Kennedy was murdered, just coincidentally and very quietly, and he was also part of British intelligence and part of explaining for the first time, and maybe that's why he died then, the role of the occult and the role of the subconscious mind in getting deeper into what is happening to the human mind. Aldous Huxley had a commentary on his own experiences transcending consciousness under mescaline, and he showed the power of inner space and projected that man is a bridge between two worlds. There's that good world that we think we are, the humanist, the kind, the Judeo-Christian, and then there is that satanic part of us. This little known fact in the brain, nervous system, sense organs, he revealed function. And part of our brain protects us against what we would think would be an overwhelming intrusion of our total mind. It acts as a block, a reducing valve to ration out that measly trickle of the kind of consciousness that keeps us alive so we can survive on the surface of this particular planet. Of course, when the goose-stepping, Gestapo, and the Blitzkrieg took place, there was no life, there was nothing. People were just stomped on, kicked out of their homes, thrown on trains and cars, and then put into ovens. That's when the reality hit them, and little trickles in their mind happened, probably from 1919 until they began to cook and were taken away and experimented upon, and Aldous Huxley talks about that. Dr. Stein, and again, he was the advisor to Winston Churchill. He was wanted by Hitler for the war purposes of continuing the knowledge of the occult. Dr. Stein predicted, because of his experiences in Vienna, that an indiscriminate use of mind-expanding drugs would sweep across America and Europe and provide millions of young people with a perilous and illicit path to revelation for which the vast majority would be totally unprepared. And that explains through Dr. Stein and British intelligence and Winston Churchill and William Sullivan and Alan Dulles of the OSS, who was working with Himmler's liaison, why Alan Dulles ordered 100 million LSD made at Sandoz Lab, that's IG Farben, to be distributed to the youth in America to change their minds, to bring out that darker part that would service the future, to make the future army and indoctrinate them with these drugs and take away that illusion of kindness or sweetness or gentleness. And as we became altruistic during the 60s and cared about Agent Orange, or killing the Vietnamese. Then whammo, out came Allen Dulles and the CIA with all of their medicals and combination of medicals called mind expansion, mind altering, that made people begin to murder each other. You see one murder after the other. They say it was drug-induced. A man kills 4 members of his family. They kill their mother and father. They gunned down 8, 10 of their best friends, and then there's a mass murder that's killing 120 and 62 sacrifices and 120. I'm beginning to pull, as I said before, out of my files. I'm separating now and cleaning out files I've had for years, and I'll find occult murders, 78 children, another occult series, 120. And when I put it all together, I'll share it with you and write it up in some form. This has been going on. I didn't want to see it. It never made sense why our intelligence community was getting 100 million LSD to give to us at home. What was wrong with us? What was wrong with our minds? Well, the purpose, obviously, with Allen Dulles of the OSS and working with Heinrich Himmler and Alan Wolf, they were getting ready to change us into their way of thinking, to see the world their way. And what we see now is madness, suicide, young people's suicide, teenagers, depressions, all kinds of insanity that never happened before, but fit in exactly to the stated goals of the kinds of people as Himmler. And this Spear of Destiny said Dr. Stein believed that the craving to experience transcendent awareness through the use of drugs would be the inevitable reaction to what was known as petrified religious dogmatism and materialism and complacency of the established order of the West. If your religion is too boring, if your parents are too materialistic, if you want too many good things, hey, take this acid, take this dope, take whatever it is, angel dust, PCB. What were the statistics last week at Stanford? 40% of the students take angel dust, but we don't know where they're going to be 5 years from now, and maybe they'll be turned into the armies of the future. Little do they know, as they have this big high or kick or the fun of the evening, where it's going to take them later if the purpose was to take them somewhere else. And this book continues that as we turned aside, the purpose was to turn people away from the religious dogmatism and materialism and then get involved with the cataclysmic events such as Hitler's war. He intended to launch the content of the Spear of Destiny, into contemporary scene. And the Spear, of course, was the spear that pierced Christ when he died on the cross, that was taken to Vienna, that influenced Hitler through a very interesting circumstance where he heard an explanation of whoever has the spear has the power. And this book says that the spear was a big influence for the vast public, and they were convinced, the people that studied it, that this would have a part in people's awareness later. In the summer of 1957, 3 days after he made the decision to start work upon the book, this Dr. Stein collapsed in London of an untimely death. The person who took over his work said, I met him after discovering a book he wrote, a definitive book on the Holy Grail, on the medieval age and the legendary quest for the Holy Grail, and studied with him the occult practices and the practice of mind expansion. The man who wrote this book worked with Dr. Stein before he passed away, and explains his influence, the influence that Stein had. He said, I started to describe my own experience of higher level of consciousness, talking with people in concentration camps during the war, and the nature of the transcendent experience, and went further into studying the Grail and researched the history into the Spear of Longinus. And the part of this introduction, and I'll just go on to another subject in a moment, it said, when the Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered Dr. Stein's arrest in Stuttgart in 1933, he wanted to press him into service of the SS Occult Bureau. They had their own occult bureau because he had studied about the spear and the history and legend behind it. But Dr. Stein escaped from Germany. He was taken to Britain and became the most authoritative knowledge of the occultism of the Nazi Party. And in this book it tells how Hitler, who was young, he was an artist, 24 years old, went to the Habsburg treasure house to visit. He was killing some time on a certain day, and he was looking at the treasures there of the Habsburg dynasty, and he was cynical about them and about the dynasty itself. And then there was a museum tour guide who was talking to foreign politicians at the museum. And this book continues, the foreigners stopped almost immediately in front of where I was standing. This is Hitler writing Mein Kampf, while their guide pointed to an ancient spearhead. At first, I didn't even bother to listen to what the expert had to say about it, merely regarding the presence of the party as an intrusion in the privacy of my own despairing thoughts that day. And then I heard the words which were to change my whole life. In quotes, the tour guide said, there is a legend associated with this spear that went into the body of Christ, that whoever claims it and solves its secrets holds the destiny of the world in his hands for good or evil. Now, Barbara Honegger said she believed when she was in Washington working at the White House that I mentioned before it was Annapolis. She said the spear of destiny, this spear was taken from Europe after the war and is at West Point, where our American military is now. And that would also explain why the West Point nursery schools, the daycare centers, the top Joint Chiefs, NATO officials are training little children for the Nazism of the future into the Reich while they're very little, and teaching them human sacrifices, and then the adults going to Himmler's castle. And if Himmler is alive, and if this one non-commissioned officer didn't bury him, it makes the whole story even more sinister. Now, in the book Nazis Go Underground, which I've mentioned many, many times on this program, I just want to make one reference because the planning of going underground was Heinrich Himmler. I doubt if he would let himself be arrested by the Americans after planning the departure of him and Bormann and the top Nazis after World War II. And, of course, that book begins, the Nazis went underground May 16th, 1943. In May of 1943, the Gestapo, and that is one of Heinrich Himmler's organizations, was definitely put in charge of the entire preparatory work for the Nazi underground after the war. And again in 1943, Alan Dulles was over there in Bern, Switzerland, with Himmler's top aides, and particularly SS Karl Wolff. And Mr. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, began doing something for Himmler, getting ready for the next transition stage. And Dr. Goebbels decided by the end of 1943, and that gave them 2 years now before the war is over, to distribute 4 million picture postcards showing smiling Himmler talking to children. This would prove that he is a human being, even as you and I. And remember all the pictures of Adolf Hitler leaning down with Eva Braun with little children, how important that is, the little children. That was all planned, so you wouldn't think of him as a devil later. You'd think of him as loving children, and it is the little children that are being taken in to the daycare centers on the military bases around the country and in private nursery schools, and being taught, one little boy up in the Bay Area, 3 years old, giving the goose step and the arm up in the air while he's complaining that his penis is sore and possibly he's already had a vasectomy because of needles into his testicles. This is going on in the United States of America. My goal, I think, if I have one for 1988, is to pursue the links from nursery school and tiny children to the Defense Department, to the highest military, the links of Oliver North, possibly with the Delta Force, absolutely with Michael Aquino. How far are we going to go? And maybe the answer would be in demanding that the body, the grave, be open of where Himmler is and find this non-commissioned officer if he's alive. If he isn't, he's the only person on whose shoulders it rests that Himmler is dead. And if the papers of the United Nations were opened up this past week and the Himmler's name was among the papers of the war criminals, then they didn't think he was dead because they wouldn't have sent the name of every dead Nazi over here. Those were live people that were being protected, and his name was among those. And of all the names, there are hardly any mentioned in all the news stories, the UN papers and files, except Heinrich Himmler's, and his were sent back to Germany. Why did they even come here if he was dead in 1945? Now, last week, changing the subject for the next 10 minutes, last week I talked about the neutron bomb because of the summit and the meeting of President Reagan with Mr. Gorbachev, and how I believe and know from papers in Germany that the atomic warheads are being replaced with neutron bombs. And I wanted to update you on a couple of items on the neutron bomb because that also is so important because of what it does and the implications of the neutron bomb that I talk about quite a bit. The Washington Post, December the 11th, has a long article on the trial of Mr. Vanunu, Mordecai Vanunu, in Israel because he allegedly told the world about Israeli's nuclear capability, but as I've said before, in the London Times, he talked about the neutron capability, the neutron bombs that Israel had, and he was kidnapped and sent to Israel 2 days before the London Times story broke, 3 weeks after the explosion at Cameroon, that I believed Israel had tested the neutron bomb. And the need for sequestering Vanunu is because Israel doesn't want the responsibility for killing 1,200 or more people in Cameroon while they were testing for the United States. They said they don't want to be fall guy for the Iran-Contra story. And here is a little account in the Washington Post of the trial of Vanunu as it's taking place. We've heard about the Gulag and the Soviet Union. Let me ask you if this is a democracy in Israel and what is going on and what is their secret. The article is titled, Israel's Secret Treason Trial, Publicly Kept in the Dark About the Case Involving Nuclear Technician. In Jerusalem, a bus every morning with whitewashed windows pulls into an alley. A handcuffed man emerges. He's whisked by the guards into doors where they're locked. The windows are blocked with plywood. Nobody can see him from when he leaves until when he goes back to wherever he's kept. In the dark, heavily guarded chamber, the secret trial of Mordecai Vanunu has reconvened after a 3-month adjournment. Not only has the state hung a curtain of secrecy over the trial, it has censored local wire service press reporting in an attempt to eliminate virtually any reference to Vanunu's line of defending himself or to the testimony of any single witness. Under Israel's press laws, the military censor can order the suppression of information that they think is damaging to state security. The prosecution and defense are under legal gag orders. Defense witnesses have been told they would be prosecuted. If they discuss their testimony with anybody, they will be prosecuted. Vanunu's brother Asher said he and his other brother Meyer were warned by police that they would face legal charges and be arrested for allegedly disclosing to reporters how their brother was returned to Israel. And we know he was injected with a drug and kidnapped in Rome, taken out of London and sequestered from Rome to Israel. They will be arrested if they tell how he got to Israel, or if they portray their brother in a sympathetic light to the press, like he's a nice guy or he means well or he wanted peace. If they make their brother sympathetic to the press, they can be prosecuted as criminals themselves. Vanunu has revealed about Israel's weapons capability, according to the Washington Post, to a dozen. They have a dozen or more atomic bombs. In fact, it is more sophisticated. What he's saying is that Israel's capability includes 100 hydrogen and neutron, as well as atomic devices. There's the word neutron that came out in the London Times, the neutron bomb. That story came out 3 weeks after the Cameroon testing. He smuggled photographs and data out of Israel, gave them to the London Sunday Times. The prosecution has completed its case. They focused on his subsequent confession. Now his lawyers arguing on why he took the secrets of Israel's nuclear bomb program. Israel's refused to submit to the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, nor will it allow international inspection of their nuclear facilities. Mr. Vanunu has requested 2 people from the Israeli government to testify at his trial. One is Ada Aben, chairman of the parliament's influential foreign affairs, and the other is Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, who was prime minister when the Vanunu case broke last fall and who reportedly ordered Israel's Mossad spy agency to get him back to Israel. And it was Shimon Peres who flew into Cameroon as soon as the bomb went off. I believe it was a neutron bomb and not a gas out of the lake. And he came in with 17 doctors, and he ordered Vanunu arrested and kidnapped and taken to Israel, where he hasn't been seen or heard since. And Mr. Vanunu wants Shimon Peres to testify at the trial. He picked him up before the London Sunday Times broke about Israel's capability with a neutron bomb. He is escorted by police. They slap him around. They slap his brothers around. They mock them verbally. They attempt to make them emotional and unstable during the testimony and beat him up and humiliate him so he'll look silly. The defense has challenged the lid of secrecy. he had to go in with some kind of a device over his mouth, so if he spoke up to the press, they wouldn't hear him. He wore a large mouth guard to prevent him from calling to a reporter, and a shrill siren was sounded when he entered and left the courthouse, similar to Ronald Reagan's helicopter, so he can't answer questions before and after going to Camp David and returning. Now, back in my files in 1985, I had an article which I was referring to that came out in Germany in 1987. It's titled French Bigwigs in Pacific for Neutron Warhead Test. And that has to do with a vessel named Greenpeace, a replacement for the Rainbow Warrior that was sunk by the French Secret Service. The Rainbow Warrior was to have led a flotilla of boats to Marua to protest the French nuclear testing. And as I said before, the German newspapers now are calling the testing a neutron bomb. It was a neutron bomb that was tested down there. And I had this among my articles in 1985. It's 1987 in Germany, and they're talking about the testing of the neutron bomb by the French down in the South Pacific. And also this morning's paper had a story, H-bombs may be in the sea off Greenland. And Denmark is suing the United States for $111 million because a United States strategic bomber crashed in 1968 and is leaving. It was a hydrogen bomb that has exploded under the sea, and it is causing cancer and ill effects. People are getting radiation poisoning off the sea in Greenland. And this went down in 1968. Israel has the hydrogen bomb and the neutron bomb, but we also had a neutron bomb that went off, a hydrogen rather, off of Greenland that's causing cancer. And if they couldn't photograph or see it, which the Danish television did, they could blame for generations to come the Russians with Chernobyl and say the cancer came from the Chernobyl explosion. It actually came from the United States hydrogen bomb, which has been located and is leaking and causing radiation up in that part of the world, and we're actually contaminating the waters with this kind of material. Well, this is enough for this particular hour. I think the occult and Himmler and these stories will blend together more and more as I begin to lift a veil in my own mind to see things just a little more clearly to what I had before, to reread it and put it with new material coming out and finding explanations for things that were happening but couldn't be explained before. And when you understand that the judges and Winston Churchill forbid the mentioning of the occult during the Nuremberg trials, you have to wonder how high up this is and how many of them are part of the actual occultism or members of groups that are protecting the worship of Satan and the Third Reich and the things that Heinrich Himmler believed in. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the conclusion of this particular part of the broadcasting. The previous hour of World Watchers was made possible in part by Aries Art in the heart of Capitola Village, serving Santa Cruz's growing consciousness for 20